Welcome to the Healthy Relationships Initiative podcast. Our goal is to provide information and tools to help you build happier, healthier, and safer relationships of all kinds. To learn more about HRI, please visit www.guilfordhri.org and check us out on social media at GuilfordHRI.
The topic of today's program is healthy boundaries in relationships. Today, we're joined by Dr. Allison Powell of Allison Powell Counseling, which is a private counseling practice here in Greensboro. First of all, just to give a background about myself, my name is Christine Murray, and I'm the director of the Healthy Relationships Initiative, and I'm also a professor in the counseling department at UNCG, where I coordinate our couple and family counseling program. And I also want to welcome our featured expert for today, who is Allison Powell. She's a licensed professional counselor, and she is the owner of Allison Powell Counseling Services. So Allison, can you tell us a little bit more about your background and specifically your expertise related to this topic today of healthy boundaries?
Absolutely, I'd be glad to, and thank you for having me. First of all, it's an honor to be here and be sitting across from you. I've known Christine for several years and as a mentor as well, so thank you for having me. I am a private practitioner and licensed professional counselor here in Greensboro, and I worked at the beginning of my career for many years in outpatient and inpatient settings, doing mostly trauma and crisis intervention work. And so that was really the beginning of my career, and I kind of fell in love with that type of work, and especially with having the opportunity to sit with people in some of their most vulnerable moments and really bear witness to that, but also to see them find their strengths and be able to grow and heal, and in some cases even be happier after going through traumatic experiences. And in 2014, I earned my PhD. I went back to graduate school so that I could teach and also research. And through that process, I really sunk deeper into attachment theory, which is one of the guiding theories that I use in my practice and in most of my work. And it's always been an interest area of mine. It's always made a lot of sense to me. I've always had a lot of interest and really intrigue about relationships, the way we form them, what happens when they rupture, how do we heal them, and why do we need them in our lives. And you know, it's my true belief that we are inherently social creatures and that we need both our own individuality, our own space, but also connection with others in order to thrive. And attachment theory says a lot about how and why that happens. So I got sort of the academic background in that and went on to teach in academia for several years and became more, entrenched in research and scholarship on trauma, and then decided to make the shift back into clinical work, into private practice a couple of years ago, and really, because I had gotten a lot of depth from scholarship and theory that helped me understand trauma in a way I hadn't before, and I really was craving coming back and working with clients directly, and so that's kind of brought me to where I am today.
Great.
And I specialize in my practice in working with relational and attachment trauma, as well as other types of trauma.
Mm-hmm. So certainly, I know you mentioned attachment theory a lot in there, and that's a real area of expertise that you practice from. And definitely that's a topic that's going to have a lot to do with boundaries. So
Absolutely.
I think you're the perfect person to be joining us for today's program. And so we're going to go ahead and jump right into our topic of the day. I do want to remind everybody who's here and being part of this program live that you are able to submit questions through the chat room, and we will be able to take your questions. We'll definitely leave time for that at the end, as well as possibly during the program. So let's just jump right into our topic of healthy boundaries. And so this topic of boundaries is such an important one for almost any type of relationship. But boundaries are also a really complicated area of relationships for many people.
Absolutely.
They can be very difficult for people to set and maintain, and this is really true whether we're talking about very close relationships, but also other types of relationships that maybe aren't so close, like working with your colleagues or neighbor types of relationships. So we've got a lot of ground to cover today, and so to get us started, what is a boundary, and specifically, what do we mean when we're talking about boundaries in relationships?
Yeah, so a relational boundary in its most basic sense is sort of the line we draw between ourselves and other people that helps distinguish us from them, so where we end and other people begin, but that also determines to what degree other people can affect us and our life space, the way we live our lives, and vice versa, the way we can affect them. You know, these lines are invisible in the sense that we can't really see or touch them, but we can sense them in ways that are maybe a little bit more intuitive and also less tangible, which makes that kind of hard for people sometimes to sense where their boundaries are. And we sense that in the way, say, that we feel when we're in a certain relationship, or the thoughts that we have, beliefs we have about ourselves or about other people through messages we get in our relationships. And so, in one sense, you know, you may have some relationships that feel just really good and affirming, and when you're around those people, you feel like they see you, they honor who you are, they want to see you grow and be a good person. And there are other relationships that may feel threatening or dangerous in some ways, or where it feels like maybe somebody is not giving you the space to be who you are or is shaming you. So those are sort of extremes of the spectrum, and I know we'll talk more about that later. In terms of the importance of boundaries, I think about 4 main functions that they serve. The first is to distinguish me from other people, and so how am I unique? How am I my own person? You know, where does my space end? The second is to protect us from relationships that might be harmful or threatening to us in some way. The third is to connect us to people, which we often think about boundaries as being a division, but they're also there to allow us to connect in meaningful and growth-promoting ways. And then the fourth is to allow us to adapt. So some situations are safer than others in life, and our boundaries need to be adaptable so that when we're with one person, they make a look a certain way and differently in different situations, or even as we age and go through life phases, that may change.
So it sounds like you're saying that a boundary could be healthy and it could look very different in different relationships. So you said some relationships aren't as safe as others. So in that relationship, a boundary may be very strong and very firm, or very kind of keep the person a little bit farther, but in a closer relationship, it might be a more flexible boundary potentially.
Yeah, and one way that I like to kind of visualize this, because boundaries are invisible, but what if they weren't? And if we could think about it like that for a moment, like thinking about my own boundaries, if I'm like walking around in life in this kind of capsule, right? That's what it's like. In relationships, say with my spouse or very close friends, that might look something like a bubble, where it's very transparent. People can see a lot of me. I allow that. It's fluid, so they could interact with me, they could get close with me. But say at work, it might look something more like maybe a balloon, where you can't see as much of my life or only what I choose to show. Mm-hmm. Then with somebody who maybe has caused me harm or hurt me in the past, I may need a firmer boundary there. And so it may even look something like a brick wall. Mm-hmm. And I have the choice to maybe take a brick out here and there and look through, but I really don't want to let that person see much of who I am or get close to me, because that's threatening.
Yeah, that's such a helpful visual to really try to think about different sort of substances or different types of materials that might create a boundary, even though it's all sort of a visual image. But I think it is a really helpful way for people to think about boundaries in their lives and sort of what that might look like in the context of different relationships.
Yeah, I think so. It also gives you an interesting visual at the grocery store.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, some people you want to have that stronger barrier up against. Your comments really made me think about what comes first, a healthy boundary or a healthy relationship. And so I often would think about it in terms of we set healthy boundaries because we want to build healthy relationships, but maybe healthy relationships sort of naturally have healthy boundaries. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think healthy relationships, I think I would agree with the statement. Healthy relationships sort of naturally have healthy boundaries, that maybe the two go hand in hand, and perhaps sort of a chicken egg situation. But I also think, of course, from the perspective of attachment theory, about those early relationships in which we learn what to expect and we learn what boundaries actually are. And in healthy, secure relationships, we learn that we can be independent, we can explore the world, but that also there are trusted people that will always be there when we need comfort or need something, a need met from them. And if you had that kind of situation growing up, you're more likely as an adult to have healthier relationships, healthy boundaries, be able to adapt, and know what you need to protect yourself from and what you want to open yourself up to. But there are situations where what we learn as children may not be quite as healthy. There may be, extremes where we either develop too much independence and beliefs that we cannot rely on other people. As adults, that might look like keeping a lot of people at a distance, craving closer relationships, not being able to have it. The other extreme would be growing up with a caretaker who maybe had trouble seeing us as separate from them, really relied on us to feel good about themselves, to meet their needs, not placing blame on the caretakers because, they probably have their own story and, things that contributed to that life situations, but that can result in somebody as an adult who really struggles separating themselves from others and maybe codependent relationships. And so when you talk about kind of which came first, the healthy relationship or the healthy boundary, I would maybe argue the healthy relationship stemming back to the ways we learned as children to interact with other people. And if that wasn't a great model, then our compass for what a healthy boundary is as adults might be a little off. And that can really be a struggle for people.
But the great news is that people can learn how to set healthy boundaries today, which is part of what we'll talk about a little bit later.
Yes.
That's the right thing. Yes. But that's a great point that you raised, that people who grew up in an environment where maybe they didn't see healthy boundaries or they experienced a lot of boundary violations, that it might be harder for them, or they might have a more difficult time building healthy boundaries in their relationships as they become an adult. So, and I think that sort of leads to the next point to discuss, which is that really a lot of people don't even think a lot about boundaries in relationships until the boundaries have been crossed. And so a lot of times then they're not even thinking, well, boy, my boundary was just crossed right there, but they might just be finding themselves feeling upset, frustrated, or exhausted, but still not really realize that it's a boundary issue in their relationship. So let's talk for a moment about boundary crossings in relationships. What are some examples of those, and what are some of the different ways that they might play out in relationships?
Okay. So a boundary crossing is really any time that somebody crosses the line into our emotional, physical, mental space in a way that violates our sense of safety, security, and trust in that relationship. And it's sort of like bursting our proverbial bubble, if we continue the metaphor from before. So sometimes that's really clear, like somebody who won't take no for an answer, or sometimes it's a little harder to detect, as you pointed out, like somebody who may be emotionally manipulative in a relationship, and it's kind of more insidious in that way. And I think it's also harder, and this is part of why people don't realize until after it's been crossed, because we can't see and touch our boundaries. We sense them through our feelings, through our internal world, through the thoughts that we're having about ourselves and other people. And if you're not somebody who is very attuned to that or used to thinking about, how do I feel in this relationship? What am I thinking about myself right now? It may be harder for you to see that coming. And you may not realize it until the boundary's been crossed and you feel just bad. And you can tell you've been violated, you can tell something's off, but it's sort of hard to put your finger on it.
So you may feel hurt and feel confused or upset, but you may not necessarily realize that it's resulting from the other person doing something that crosses your boundary.
Exactly.
But I really liked what you said, that it's something that violates the safety, security, and trust in a relationship, and that is a really helpful way also to think about then a positive boundary in a relationship, or a healthy boundary, looks like a boundary that helps to build safety, security, and trust both for that person individually and in the relationship. And then anything that sort of violates that becomes maybe some sort of unhealthy boundary.
Yeah, I would say that. I think, unhealthy boundaries could also be, go too much to the extreme. So unhealthy dynamics could happen when there's been a boundary crossing. Also when our boundaries fail to adapt in appropriate ways, depending on the relationship. So when they're either too firm or rigid, keeping people away, who may actually be, safe, trusting people who could help us live more fulfilling lives, or allowing people in and to get too close who could threaten us. So it's kind of, again, when our compass is off about that, we're way more open to boundary violations and also boundaries that just aren't in keeping with the nature of the relationship or the safety of the relationship in reality. Maybe somebody is responding to how they felt in a relationship many years ago, and this person reminds them of that. So, you know, it's not actually about that person or that relationship. It's a trauma response, really.
Yeah, no, definitely, that's a great point. And so let's talk a little bit more about how do we build healthy boundaries in relationships. So just what are some other points that you would raise about what do boundaries look like in healthy relationships? What's the vision for what people want to be building when it comes to healthy boundaries?
Absolutely. So I think boundaries in healthy relationships, again, meet those 4 functions. So they define who we are. So we have a clear sense of self. You know, we can talk about the unique characteristics that make me me, and it's okay that I'm different. It's okay that I have different opinions than other people I'm in relationship with. That doesn't mean we can't be in a relationship, you know. So that's kind of a gauge for making sure that that definition piece is in place. A healthy boundary is also going to protect us from danger and is also going to allow us to connect where we want to connect. So anytime we're feeling like we are lonely, isolated, or our space or voice is being sort of silenced, shrunken, you know, we're being shamed, we're not being allowed to be who we are, those are indicators that there's not a healthy boundary there, and that maybe we're either protecting or connecting too much for our own needs. And then the 4th quality, they have to be adaptable. And so again, if we have trouble, you know, if we kind of generalize, I got hurt once, and so I'm going to protect myself, but not just in that relationship, in every relationship. That's also an indication of an unhealthy boundary. So a healthy boundary is going to be one that can shift where it needs to, depending on the context.
And so the other thing that I'm thinking about is that boundaries in relationships, we can talk about a boundary between people.
Right.
So, you know, the 2 of us here, there's a boundary between us, but then also a boundary around relationships as well. That's sort of interesting to think about. So people could have a healthy boundary, maybe let's say within their relationship, but then maybe there are things where there are a lack of clarity of the boundaries around a relationship in the outside world. So sometimes you hear a lot about, obviously, in-laws causing problems in marriages, or I think what's very common in today's world where we're just busy is even thinking about like a boundary around a family or a couple with technology and infusing that. So what thoughts do you have on that, about this idea of boundaries between people and then boundaries around relationships?
Well, I think it's absolutely true that we have multiple layers of boundaries and a need sometimes to protect our unit, whatever that is, whether it's a friendship, a couple, a family, from potential threats. So again, I go back to the boundary is there to protect us and to connect us. And I think just as it can be between individuals, there can be healthy and unhealthy boundaries around a unit, shall we call it, you know, a relationship that either separate it from the outside world. So I think about couples who maybe become very codependent with each other and kind of sink into each other almost, and also can be overly connected, overly permeable, such that maybe it's not holding the people together in the way that they would like, and you know, people are having needs met outside of the relationship. I think about values too, and I think about that. So both for an individual and for like a unit or a relationship, I think clarifying what's most important and sharing that, you know, making sure that that's a unified perspective can help with establishing healthier boundaries so that everyone is aligning their relationships in the way that is uplifting and fulfilling for them and also for their relationship unit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And you raised the point about values, and I just think one of the things that gets very complicated about boundaries, and that sometimes people do have some reactions to, is that really the values around cultural influences can really impact what it means to be healthy. And so we're we're using the terminology today, healthy, and I think you can tell me if you don't agree with me on this, but I think probably you agree with me about this, that really by healthy, we're sort of letting each individual define what that looks like for them, right? So
Absolutely.
There's not necessarily a real objective definition of what a healthy boundary looks like, or even a healthy relationship to some extent, although we know there's some common elements across healthy relationships. But what role does culture play in how people might define healthy relationships and what that looks like for them and their relationships or their family?
I absolutely agree. I don't think there is a right or wrong way to draw boundaries. It depends on the individual, it depends on their values, it depends on what's happened in their life and what kind of space they need in the world, and what kind of connection they need in the world. And so instead of thinking about it as right or wrong, and this does for me generalize to the way I think about the cultural role in boundary formation, is to think instead about what is growth promoting, what honors me as an individual, what is supportive, what types of relationships make me feel that way, and affirm who I am and my goals in life, versus those that feel like they're dangerous, they're harmful, they threaten my space in the world, they threaten who I know I am as a person, or shame me in some way. And so when I think about culture, there are some cultures where it is the norm for there to be probably more connectivity, more permeability with boundaries, especially within families or like communities. And there are also in more individualistic cultures, it's appropriate to have firmer boundaries. And it may seem very strange to somebody who lives that way, that other people live with more closeness, maybe in the same household for longer, these kind of things. And I would say there's nothing wrong with either way, unless somebody is getting hurt or their right to taking up their space in the world is being threatened in some way.
If they feel their personal growth or their ability to be themselves is starting to be violated. So again, so it might be a certain cultural value around what a boundary should look like in families or relationships looks a certain way, but then it's really up to each individual person to really spend that time thinking about, is this healthy for me? Am I growing? Do I feel safe in these relationships? Is the sort of context of this relationship holding me back in some way? And so it sounds like, too, thinking back to what you had said earlier, somebody who grew up in an environment where they maybe did not experience healthy boundaries or see that, it seems like that might be very difficult for them to be really aware of those things. So what should people do if they're having a hard time sort of sorting through some of these questions that they might be having?
That is a great question, and one that comes up a lot with clients that I see. It's something that brings a lot of clients to counseling, I think, is I just don't feel like I even know what a healthy boundary is or what my boundaries look like. And I think about a couple of things there. I think, first, like I said, if it's somebody who is not as attuned to their emotions and their thoughts and all of that, it may be harder to catch. Those are skills we can teach, and honestly, they're fairly easy to teach, somebody how to gauge that. It becomes more complicated when your compass is off, so to speak, for what a healthy relationship should look like. And to that note, I would say the first thing that's important is to give yourself the right to draw your boundary. And that's a real struggle for some people, to give themselves the right to have boundaries even to begin with, if they didn't see that growing up. So to anyone listening who may fall into that category, I would say you always, always, always have the right to draw and redraw your boundaries, and in any way you need and however many times you need. So first, give yourself permission for that. Second is awareness, I think. A couple of exercises that you can try if you're somebody who is listening and going, I'm not really sure what my boundaries look like, which, I've been there, I know that feeling, is to think about patterns in the relationships you have. Maybe even make a pros and cons list. Think about relationships that feel good, fulfilling, the things we've talked about that characterize a healthy boundary, and relationships that feel uncomfortable to you, feel threatening, feel unsafe, and look at what it is that makes you feel unsafe, what it is that makes you feel good. Do you have specific memories of times that really stood out to you? Can you see themes or patterns in that? And can you draw those back to anywhere in your own life? So I think we're talking a lot, too, about how other people can violate our boundaries. We can violate other people's boundaries, too, and sometimes that's something that we're really unaware of, and it may have come from a very early and honest place. So really looking at those patterns, I think, helps clarify some of those questions. And that can help you define what for you might be a healthy boundary, and then, take steps, which we can talk about.
Yeah, that seems it seems to be very empowering for people to understand that they have the right to set boundaries, and that they can change over time, and that that's something that is part of the process of building healthy relationships, and sort of protecting yourself in the context of a relationship.
Absolutely, and especially if you grew up with not a great model for healthy boundaries, it can be so empowering to say, I can change this.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked several times already today about how people may not realize that boundaries until they're sort of crossed,
Mm-hmm.
so they may not think much about boundaries until then, and then they realize, okay, maybe I need to change things to
Mm-hmm.
to move toward a more healthy place in that
Mm-hmm.
regard in my relationships. But are there things that people can do to be more proactive in building healthy boundaries within the context of their relationship, so they don't necessarily have to wait until a boundary has been crossed or violated before they do something about it?
Yeah, I think one question that comes up for me is the nature of the relationship. And obviously that's going to vary. We all have tons of relationships. It's very complex. But you do have to think about, is this a transactional relationship? Or is this meant to be a close relationship? Is this somebody who's really integral to my sense of self? How you might handle that and draw either proactively or defensively, draw that boundary might vary. So I think there's a formula that I keep in mind a lot and share with clients in kind of the first line of defense is just explicitly stating your boundary. And maybe the other person doesn't realize they've crossed it either, or that it even exists. So when my kind of formula for that is first affirming, acknowledging the other person, their desire, their need, stating my own needs, and then if it feels like a safe relationship, maybe pointing out a shared goal and asking how we can negotiate that boundary in a way that makes us both feel good. So an example might be, say at work, I have a coworker who's always wanting me to stay late. I have a family, that's a high value for me, so that's a boundary, I'm not going to stay late. So I might say to them, I know it's really important for you to do good work and for us to be able to work together successfully. That's important to me too. I need to leave work by 5. And so what solution might there be? What could we negotiate here that would work so that I can leave at 5, and then also we can get the work done we need to.
And I like the way that you're describing it as more of a dialogue in relationships, because I think sometimes it's like, well, I'm going to set this boundary, and it's sort of like, I'm going to set all these rules with the people in my life, and it really, in a healthy relationship, I think it does look more like that dialogue, and it's almost also an invitation, not just to say, I'm going to tell you about my boundaries, and I expect you to uphold them, but to really, if you, especially in a very close relationship, if you really care about someone, saying, I want to understand your boundaries too. What would make you feel safe? What can I do? And, understand the things that might make that person lose their sense of safety, security, and trust in that relationship.
Absolutely. Remember, they need connection too. And there's some reason you're in relation to them, so they probably want that connection with you. And if there's a way to navigate that boundary and reestablish it while maintaining that relationship, that's the ideal. Doesn't always happen that way, but that's the ideal.
Right. So it sounds like a lot of talking about it with the people in your life and the people who are important to you. Obviously, in less close relationships, that might not be the case of how you establish it.
Your needs are different.
Yeah, but just figuring out polite ways almost of communicating what those boundaries are to people. I think with boundaries, you sort of, one example, like the neighbor, you think about neighbors fighting over like where the property line ends or things, that sort of thing.
Literal boundary.
literal boundaries,
Yeah.
but it's, you know, just I think in general in relationships, obviously with the Healthy Relationships Initiative, we always want to promote positive relationship skills and positive relationship building ways of communicating. And so those really go a long way too. And in some ways too, I think even that can be a boundary in and of itself in sort of saying like what kind of conversations you'll be part of. You know, I tell my kids sometimes when they're getting pulled into a fight, I'm like, you don't have to go into every fight that you're invited to participate in, right? So, you know,
you can always choose.
Yeah, you can make a choice about, say, you know, you're not speaking to me in a nice way right now, so I'm not going to engage in this conversation until we can talk about it in a healthy way. So, you know, it really always is going to vary a lot based on what's happening and where, you know, what kind of relationship you're in and what's going on in that relationship. But I think the idea of really communicating about it, having a dialogue, understanding that the other person has boundaries too, and to want to understand those too, that it's really a give and take in many ways in relationships.
In cases you could be crossing theirs, you know. Yeah. And I think I really appreciate what you've said there, and it reminds me too that like that example I just gave is the ideal. If you're going to have that kind of open conversation, that's a very vulnerable conversation to have with somebody, especially if it's somebody who's very core, you know, close to you. And so that has to feel like a safe thing to approach. And if it doesn't, there are other options. You can redraw your boundaries as many times as you need. So you may need to look at that and say, do I need some distance from this person? Could I ever come back and have this kind of a conversation with them? And if that doesn't feel like it's ever going to be safe, you know, do I need a really firm, distant boundary? Or even in some extreme cases, you know, I've had clients who've decided that they need to end a relationship because their boundaries keep getting violated. And that is completely okay too.
Yeah. So let's delve a little bit more into that as to what people can do when they have some challenges with boundaries in their relationships. And so let's say that you have really been clear about your boundaries when you're in a relationship. So let's say let's use your workplace example, because I think that is people struggle a lot with that boundary of work and family life and work and home life. And so let's say, you know, that you've set that boundary, 5 o'clock, I need to leave, I need to be home with my family, and it continues to get crossed in certain ways. Like maybe there was initial agreement about it, but then 4:55 every day the boss is coming in and saying, oh, I need you to do this, or starting a conversation that seems to go on forever and ever. So that's just one example. So you might have other ways of thinking about this too, and maybe closer relationships or other different kinds of relationships. But what should somebody do if they're in a relationship of any kind with somebody and that person continually violates the boundaries that have been pretty clearly set?
Well, first of all, I would say the most important thing is clarity and consistency with yourself. And this is why I talk about things like values clarification and giving yourself permission to own that you need boundaries. You have the right to boundaries. Because it can be really hard when you say, I need to leave at 5, but somebody who has power over you, or somebody like a parent, a child, a partner says, that's not okay with me. I'm not going to let you do that. And it's so important, I think, in those cases to be consistent and to restate that boundary and restate it over and over and over again, even if it feels repetitive, and that your behaviors match what you're stating. I'm not going to let you violate this boundary of mine. I've told you where it is, and I'm not going to let you in. And if the violation continues, that's where I would be talking with somebody about renegotiating those boundaries. Do you feel like you can agree on the boundary, or is this somebody who can't respect yours? In which case, you may need to, you know, reconsider the transparency and accessibility of your boundary with them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so to some extent you try to negotiate it with the other person, and then eventually if they're not really cooperating with you, then it sounds like it's time to go more internal and figure out what your response is. And I guess it sounds like you don't always need to tell another person if you're deciding to change something in the context of the boundaries of the relationship,
not necessarily.
Right? So you might make that as a change, and maybe it's not even safe to go and communicate to them about something. So, for example, in the job example, you know, maybe it's constantly being violated. the person needs their paycheck, but maybe they decide they've tried so hard to work through this, it's not being respected, it's impacting their home life, and so maybe they start to look for another job, and they may not have to tell the boss that they're doing that because that's something that they feel they need to do to protect themselves. So,
and it is their right to do that.
But it sounds like it's always probably, unless it's clearly an unsafe situation, that it's probably always wise to try to negotiate and try to work it out with the other person, and then if not, then, you know, maybe think about some different ways of handling the situation.
Yeah, and again, we go back to what's your priority in the relationship. Is this one you want to maintain? Is it one that in most ways is fulfilling to you and is a healthy relationship in your life? Maybe the person has crossed your boundaries a few times, but you want to maintain it, in which case letting them know where you stand, being transparent, letting them know what to expect from you. You know, two, I think, of our deepest fears as humans are rejection and the unexpected. And so if you're wanting to maintain the relationship, I do think that conversation is really important to kind of diffuse those fears. You know, I'm not rejecting you. I still want to be in this with you, but we need to renegotiate this in order for me to feel good as well. And also for them to know that if your boundary is going to shift, what that is going to look like practically. How often will they see you? How are you going to behave differently? Things like that. That can go a long way. And if it's a dangerous relationship, then that kind of a conversation just isn't as important. You need to protect yourself first. And so in that case, it may not be safe to have those kinds of transparent conversations.
And it can be helpful to talk to a counselor or a trusted friend or family member to help sort through that, because that can be difficult to figure out on your own. I also think one of the big challenges with boundaries is, especially if people in the past maybe haven't been very good at setting boundaries or maintaining them, and then that's something they want to work on and, you know, really develop in their relationships. And then so they start to set boundaries or do things differently in their relationships, and a lot of times that leads to pushback. People are, the other person might be used to, I think about the family that, you know, you always have to go to one person's house for the holidays. And then over time, you know, well, that maybe we don't want to always have that. Maybe we want to have a different experience. So we try to set a boundary and say, well, maybe every other year we're going to do that. And a lot of times in those cases, people get a lot of pushback. So what can you do in those cases?
Well, anytime one person in a relationship starts to do something different, other people are going to react, often kind of push back. And it's going to take some time for them to adjust, even in the healthiest relationships. So I would say the first thing is patience and also clarity. Going back to kind of what we said already, is this a relationship you want to maintain, say with family? If so, then how can you clearly state to them what you need, what is going to be different? We're not going to be coming this year. It doesn't mean that we don't care about you. It doesn't mean we don't want to spend the holidays with you, but it is exhausting to pick up our whole family, and this feels very salient right now because I have a 1-year-old child, and it is exhausting to pick up the whole family, you know, and go somewhere. And so for that reason, we need to stay here this year, but maybe next year or in 2 years, you can expect us to come. So here's what you can expect from me, and I'm going to reassure you that I'm not rejecting you. That would be one approach, I think, especially in relationships that you're wanting to maintain.
Yeah, it sounds like it's helpful to keep that sort of empathy or understanding that it is hard for people to change. If they're used to one thing and then you're introducing change into the system, that can be hard for people. So trying to be kind of patient with that.
And that's one place where I think unnecessary rigid boundaries can come in, because, you know, I say, I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to come this year, and then that could feel threatening to, say, my parent. You know, does that mean, is there something wrong? Does she not love me anymore? Is this how it's always going to be? And then they put up a rigid boundary and, you know, maybe guilt me, shame me, maybe not intentionally, but, you know, they're hurt. And so that's where those kind of actions come from. Well, then I feel hurt, and I put up my boundary, and you can see how these kind of rifts form in families and relationships very quickly if there isn't room for empathy and thinking about the other person's perspective.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've gotten some questions that have come in. We have a question, so let's take the question and then we'll look at some other practical strategies for setting healthy boundaries in relationships. So, Erica, what is the question that we've gotten?
Okay, we have, what are some ways that you can help an individual or a family couple that is unaware there are boundaries broken understand that this is possibly not healthy even if it is cultural?
An individual or family who has had boundaries broken, helping them understand that it, can you say it one more time?
That it's not healthy even if it is cultural.
Even if it is cultural. Okay, if I'm trying to envision if this is somebody I was working with, I would, first of all, I'm not sure I'm the one that gets to decide that, but I would want to explore that with them. And some of the things, so I would be asking them about, the nature of the relationship, how they're feeling when they're with that person in that relationship, what it is that keeps them coming back to that, what are they getting out of that, and some questions like that. And I would be looking for flags like, I want to please this person, I need them to accept me in order to feel okay with myself, or this is the expectation of my culture, and yet it feels dangerous or unsafe to me. It doesn't feel good to me. And that happens where there are, every culture has its own set of sort of social constructs that get created, more or less rules about appropriate behavior. Sometimes those can lead to boundary crossings too. And again, anytime somebody feels unsafe or like a relationship is damaging to their sense of self, I would say let's really sit and think about that and think about how that feels being in that. Mm-hmm. Is that something you want to continue? Because ultimately, if it's not that individual or that couple or that family's decision, then it's unlikely to change.
Yeah. And I think it probably also depends a lot on what the nature of the boundary violation is, like almost like what you're saying. I mean, definitely if there are real safety concerns or you're concerned that there might even be some sort of abuse that's going on, I mean, I think that's another level, and we need to really, reach out for professional support, talk with them. And if we're talking about if this is a friend or a family member and you're thinking, well, what can I do if I'm concerned that they're in an unhealthy relationship or that they're dealing with this unhealthy family situation, I think it's a good idea to really approach it, like you were saying, with a lot of questions and really just invite them to think about it. People often don't like to take unsolicited advice, unfortunately, and that can be really a difficult thing if you're sitting by watching somebody who seems to be in sort of experiencing an unhealthy relationship. But to encourage them, just let them know that you're concerned about them, that you want to help them, and just that you want to help them think it through. More than anything, you're not there to try to tell them what to do, unless, of course, it is a safety consideration, in which case you might be a little bit more proactive in making some recommendations for what they need to do.
And certainly providing resources so that they know what their options are and they know clear paths to acting if they want to.
And I think always the best way to help people is really to relate and connect and say, I've been there too, or I know when I was going through a similar situation, when I went to counseling, that really helped me, or journaling really helped me, or, something like that. And I think that helps people feel understood, but especially, and just kind of looking at those situations where they do feel maybe they're not saying, well, I feel like this person's really crossing my boundaries, but you could help them see, like, well, do you feel, are you being empowered in that relationship? Do you feel that your voice matters in that relationship? Do you feel supported? Because I think a lot of times when you have, especially over a period of time, a pattern of boundary crossing, what ends up happening is the relationship doesn't feel very two-sided. So that can be another really helpful way to talk about that topic with people.
Agreed. Yeah, and I think also in this kind of last point that I'll make, it's important to acknowledge the conflict too. So it has to be really confusing and maybe even sort of a desperate feeling to be in a position where a bunch of people in your family or your culture are telling you one thing, but something doesn't feel good to you, and you are telling you something else. And again, if that's somebody who maybe didn't have a lot of great models for healthy boundaries, they may struggle trusting that feeling in themselves and really rely more on what other people are telling them. So it can really be such a conflicting feeling, and I think acknowledgement of that is important.
Yeah, great. Was there another question that we got in the meantime?
We have some comments.
Some comments? Okay. Do you want to?
All right. We have a comment that was saying that this reminds of some of the work that they do in the DBT skills training, and they love the discussion about clearly defining boundaries while also maintaining a relationship if this is the primary goal for the client.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I mean, that's obviously coming from a counseling perspective, and DBT is dialectical behavioral therapy, which is a specific approach to counseling for those who may not be counselors in the audience, but definitely thinking about it being a healthy process for people and just something that really is a skill that in many ways is very transferable to different areas of life, right? So if I'm struggling with boundaries in a relationship with a partner, chances are maybe I also struggle with boundaries in other relationships too. So it's definitely one of the reasons why I think this is a really powerful topic and a really powerful area of life for people to think about, is because if they can start to become more aware and more proactive in establishing healthy boundaries and building healthy boundaries, I think that it's something that can carry over and they'll find benefits in a lot of different areas of life.
Agreed. And I think that the skill building part, and DBT has a fantastic set of skills to help in all kinds of boundary drawing, but realizing that you can build the skills to do that and empower yourself to do that, and that it can feel so helpless to be in a relationship where you don't know where the boundaries are, or it feels like they keep getting crossed. But I think about striking a balance between self-awareness, where is that coming from, how are these patterns getting created, and building skills and practicing those skills so that you see yourself, you know, protecting yourself and taking up your space and taking back your voice. It can be really empowering for folks. And
what about on a practical level for people who do feel that their boundary issue is maybe not people walking all over them, but maybe their boundary is being too rigid and maybe they don't really feel safe with anybody, you know, they don't trust anybody, so they keep a wall up. What should people do on a practical level in that situation to maybe build more opportunities for connecting, but also maintain a sense of safety with some boundaries?
Well, that's the key right there, is the balance between safety, protection, and connection. And so as somebody that's finding that, especially in a lot of different areas, they're drawing really rigid boundaries, and they don't like that. And to me, that's an important piece, you know, because you may have very rigid boundaries and you're happy with that and it's not bothering you. That's fine. But if you don't like that and you want to see it change, then you might be looking at questions like, what am I protecting myself from? You know, and if I'm not happy with the level of connection in my relationships, what do I want that to look like? So really making that concrete. Again, the kind of, you know, pros, cons, you know, looking at patterns in relationships, things like that can be helpful. But I think it's also about maybe recalibrating your compass, your cues, relearning your cues for what is healthy in a relationship. If that's a pattern, chances are you may not have had a whole lot of models for what healthy looks like. And so I think counseling can be a wonderful resource to help you kind of relearn that. I think turning to, if you have one or two relationships that are more like what you want, and you feel comfortable going to those people and saying, can we talk about, like, how does this work for us? You know, how can I take what works for us and make it work in other relationships? Some things like that might be helpful. But I go back to protection, and my hunch would be that that person feels they need to protect themselves from something, and maybe something that these other relationships remind them of, but chances are not every relationship needs that level of protection.
So it might be helpful for a person in that situation also to sort of list out what are some characteristics of somebody that I can trust. So I don't need to go tell my whole life story and open up everything about everything going on in my life to everybody, but let me think about, okay, what is a consistent person look like in my life, or somebody who I can feel safe around? And I think also you said something about this that made me think of it, like, what does a healthy boundary look like? What is a healthy relationship? And I think separating, in that case, healthy from perfect, and understanding that, because if you really put rigid boundaries up and that's kind of more your pattern, probably you're afraid to get hurt, and to some extent, honestly, being hurt in relationships is part of the process. Nobody's perfect. We're all going to experience, you know, times when we let other people down, people let us down. And so, you know, maybe figuring out ways also to be able to be okay with certain levels of being hurt or feeling hurt in the context of a relationship.
That reminds me of something really important that I wanted to say, too. I'm glad you brought that up, because healthy relationships doesn't mean we're never going to feel uncomfortable, and it doesn't mean we're never going to be challenged. It doesn't mean it's never going to be hard. Some of what I would consider the healthiest relationships in my life, I have had to fight for it, and the other person has had to fight for it. You know, it's work sometimes. But I think the distinction there is that when it's hard, when it feels uncomfortable, when you maybe feel like running away or putting your wall up, is it because you feel like you're being hurt or you're being reduced or shamed by that person? Or is it because maybe they're helping you think in a way that feels uncomfortable, that's stretching you, but that could actually enhance your relationship or enhance you as a person? And I think it's important to consider that it's not always perfect, and that healthy doesn't look like I always feel great all the time here.
Right. Yeah, but by keeping people really far away, you're also preventing yourself from being able to have those closer connections too. So it's tricky, especially if people do have challenging experiences in their past, for sure. So it looks like we have one more comment maybe that came in, and then we're getting close to the end of our time. So I guess this comment is a point about having clarity and consistency and boundaries, because it's easy to want to bend this person says it's easy to want to bend for the benefit of partners or other people in relationships. And so, you know, I think the more people are able to know, well, this is one thing that I'm willing to bend on, and this is something that I'm not. And that's part of healthy boundaries. It's not like I will never do, you know, A, B, C, D, E, F, or anything. You know, it's about sort of like, these are my core values that are important. I'm not willing to compromise on this, but these are all the other things that I am willing to sort of compromise on. Do you have any other thoughts on that comment?
I think yes to the values. So I think that's why values clarification is an important part of this process, because it helps you figure out that distinction sometimes. And I also want to say that your boundaries are going to get crossed. All of our boundaries are going to get crossed. I haven't met a person who's ever had that happen, unless it's somebody who is very, very protective, almost to an extreme, and then that, you know, causes another set of problems. But it's more about realizing when they do, knowing yourself, and being willing to stop and go, ooh, that didn't feel good. What's that about? You know, let me sink into that a little bit. And that's part of how you learn where your boundaries are, you know. Sometimes we think about individuation as a process of adolescence and maybe early adulthood, but I would argue it happens in different ways throughout your entire life. And sometimes that's how we learn we need to individuate. We need to draw our own space differently, is when those boundaries get crossed. And
that's a really positive and helpful way to sort of reframe. If you're feeling frustrated or hurt, it's easy to be upset and frustrated and get angry in this situation, but let's also remember that those are clues, and it's an opportunity for growth too, right? This is an opportunity to say, boy, I'm feeling this way right now. This is probably telling me that I need to look at this issue, or I need to think about this further. So I guess we're just about at the end of our time. So just to wrap us up on a few practical steps here, or some big takeaways. So what are some of the main points that you hope that the people who have been part of this program would take away from this conversation?
I think the biggest thing is giving yourself permission to take your space in the world and in your relationships. And so reminding yourself constantly that you have the right to draw your boundaries and redraw your boundaries in any way you need to, as many times as you need to. And that doesn't mean that it's not going to hurt, and it doesn't mean that other people won't react to it, doesn't mean that there won't be consequences. But you always maintain that right. And I think where I see most people unhappy in relationships is where they have in some way compromised that right, but desperately want closeness with somebody. And the irony of it is that through drawing clearer boundaries and sometimes having some of these harder conversations, I think you can really build healthier relationships, and that we can really thrive more when we are happy in the space that we're taking up and we feel like that's being respected. And the first step in that is believing that we are entitled to it.
Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a really great summary of what we've talked about today, that setting boundaries or taking more steps to build, maintain boundaries and relationships can be very uncomfortable for people, but that it actually opens the door for closer, healthier relationships over time. And so that's really powerful for people to think about as they're maybe stepping into that discomfort, but that on the other side, and sometimes it does result in relationships changing or the nature of the relationship changing, but at the end, it is a really powerful way to potentially move to a healthier place in the context of that relationship.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I think this has been really great. I'm especially excited about this because, like we were saying earlier, this is definitely a relationship skill, I guess, or a relationship practice that people can use that,
I like that term,
can really benefit them across different areas of their life. So any final thoughts from you before we wrap up?
Thank you. I really am passionate about this topic, and I hope that it's been helpful for listeners, and it's been a great time talking about it.
Great.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, the time just flew by. So we hope that everybody who is listening also enjoyed our conversation. And we do want to thank you for joining us today. We hope that you'll continue to join us for more of these relationship boosters. The next one will be on Friday, February 1st, and we'll be speaking with Dr. Esther Lurkes about bonding with your child. And you can learn more at the website, guilfordhri.org/relationship-boosters. And before you sign off for today, we're going to post the link to the feedback form in the chat room so that we can get your feedback. This is a new program that we're rolling out through the Healthy Relationships Initiative, and we always want to be improving the work that we're doing so that we can do all that we can to help all of you build happy, healthy, and safe relationships. So thanks so much for joining us today, and we hope that it was a great learning experience for you. Thank you.